Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's seasonal edition of Wharfedale Naturalists webinars. I think probably most of you are regulars. You probably already know the drill. We'll have the talk in a moment after I've introduced the speaker. But the important thing for people to remember is that if you do have questions that occur to you as you're listening to the talk, if you could put them in the Q&A as we go, that would be wonderful. That just gives Jeff a chance to put them in the right order before the Q&A session starts. Thanks once again to Anne for that incredible presentation that we always have now at the start. We've come to expect it rather, haven't we? I hope that Anne doesn't feel that she absolutely has to produce such a fantastic display every time we have a webinar, but they really are utterly spectacular. So thank you, Anne, for providing those for us yet again. Well, it gives me really great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. He will be known to very many of you, I'm sure. Tonight we have Ian Brand, who is a member of the Wharfedale Nats Committee, a relatively recent addition compared to some of us who are very long in the tooth on the committee, and some people even more long in the tooth than I am. But Ian, I think I should say, has been the most fantastic addition to the committee because he is constantly full of new ideas, enthusiasm, passion for botany in particular. He's come up with all sorts of ideas, such as the Christmas quiz, which I expect some of you have already attempted. And tonight's talk, I think, is going to be no exception to the general rule that Ian is full of excellent ideas because he's produced a special seasonal talk for us. I'll tell you what it's called in just a moment. First of all, I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Ian. Ian trained in medicine in Cardiff in the second half of the 70s. That was where he met his partner Hugh, who was doing dentistry there. Ian says the urban myth has it that they met in the dinner queue, but in fact it was the hall bar. Clearly there's some historical dispute about the actual occasion. But then Ian went on to have a very varied and interesting career. He was a senior house officer and registrar in adult medicine, had spells in paediatric and A&E, followed by 2 years as a GP on the North York Moors. And then he trained in radiology in Leeds and spent 21 very happy years working at Airedale, which I'm sure is a hospital very well known to many of us. As I've already said, his main interest is botany. He's been playing an active role, as I've already mentioned, in Wharfedale Naturalists, also in Bradford Botany Group. Some of you will, I'm sure, have already read some of his nature notes. I don't know whether you saw the recent one on poinsettia, which I found extremely interesting. And I've got a feeling they are going to be cropping up again tonight because tonight's talk is called The 12 Plants of Christmas. So without further ado, I give you Ian Brand.
Thanks very much indeed. I just need to share my screen. Hopefully you can see that. It's going to start the slideshow. Right, well, thank you much indeed, Helen, and good evening, everyone. It's lovely to be with you, even if it has to be via the ether of the internet. Now, I'd like you to sit back and relax as I take you on a festive guided tour of the 12 plants of Christmas. When I was young, I used to sing in the local church choir. I wasn't particularly religious, but I did enjoy singing along with my friends. And also earning 4 shillings, that's 20p, each time I sang in a wedding on a Saturday. And in December, we used to go around the local town singing carols for charity, and get taken out to the local villages as well, where we were actually transported on the back of a lorry, much like the one on the right. And it was great fun. And one of my favorite carols was the 12 Days of Christmas. Now, I thought that'd be a great idea to have a talk titled The 12 Plants of Christmas. But usually you do the talk and then you decide on the title. So it's the wrong way around. So how do I go about choosing 12 plants? Well, I went back to the actual carol itself to see if I could get any pointers, but there's only one plant mentioned, and that's the pear tree. But when you start to look quite closely, there are actually quite a lot of birds: swans, geese, calling birds, French hens, turtle doves, and a partridge. So by my reckoning, that's 1 point for the botanist and 6 points for the ornithologist. Now, if that wasn't bad enough, Stephen Moss, a well-known naturalist, broadcaster, and also writer, wrote a book about 3 or 4 years ago called The 12 Birds of Christmas, where he thinks every line, every gift is actually bird related. And he may well be right. Of course, we'll never know because we don't know who actually wrote the carol originally. So for me, it's very much a personal choice, and I based it on 3 criteria. First of all, symbolic. Obviously, we have Christmas on the 25th of December, but very close by, we have the pagan celebration of the winter solstice on the 21st to the 22nd of December. It's quite apt that we're giving the talk now because the actual time and date for the winter solstice this year was 4 o'clock this afternoon, when the sun was directly above the Tropic of Capricorn. Also, a lot of the pagan traditions have actually been incorporated into the Christian traditions as well. Now, a lot of these symbolic plants are actually quite decorative in their own right, but a lot of the plants we put in our house at Christmas are just decorative in their own right, without any symbolism or often any long tradition. It's also that time of the year when the nights are long and the daylight hours are short. And we like to cheer ourselves up by eating and drinking. So I've also included some food plants. Hopefully no one's going to disagree with my first 4, which we actually included in a recent Christmas card. And that's holly, ivy, mistletoe, and Norway spruce. As a botanist, I also wanted to include 2 truly winter flowering plants, and I've chosen the snowdrop and the Christmas rose, both of which grow in our garden. The next 2 are recent newcomers. They certainly weren't around when I was a youngster, but you can't go into a supermarket these days without seeing rows of poinsettias and lots of boxes of Amaryllis bulbs. And then those food plants. Well, it wouldn't be Christmas dinner without Brussels sprouts and cranberry sauce. 2 more food plants, which are quite personal. You might find rather strange their inclusion, but we'll come to that later. Blackthorn, which gives us sloes, and sweet chestnut. So there's going to be a lot to talk about. Obviously, there's going to be some botany, and it's a sort of botany you can do in front of the fire with your feet up. Because a lot of the plants I'm talking about are going to be decorating your house at the moment, or they're going to be in the garden, or certainly in the country, very close by in the countryside. There's going to be a little bit of geography and history, even a bit of entomology, ornithology, cooking tips. But last of all, and most importantly, that hopefully there's going to be some interesting stories. Now, I want to start with one, and it's not particularly plant related, but it is Christmas related. St. Nicholas, who has evolved into our modern day Santa Claus and Father Christmas, in Victorian and Edwardian times was depicted wearing a green tunic, looking relatively slim and not particularly jolly. But Father Christmas today is fat, jolly, and wears a red tunic. And that's all due to a 1930s advert by Coca-Cola. And they chose red to match their red logo. Perhaps it's also rather appropriate that he is fat and jolly due to large amounts of caffeine and sugar in your standard bottle or tin of Coca-Cola. So I'm going to give you my 12 plants of Christmas, and not particularly in any order. First one is the Norway Spruce, our traditional Christmas tree. And you can see it here in Trafalgar Square, where it's been a gift from the people of Norway to the people of Britain ever since 1947 for the help and support we gave them during the Second World War. But where did the tradition of the Christmas tree actually start? Well, there's a bit of an urban myth that it was actually Prince Albert who brought it to the UK. In fact, it was Queen Victoria's German grandmother, Queen Charlotte, who married George III and brought it across from Germany. But where did the tradition start actually in Germany? Well, we have to go back to the 8th century, when St. Boniface, who was a monk from Devon, was sent to Germany as a missionary. The story goes that he came across a group of pagans who were worshipping an oak tree. He was incensed and he grabbed an axe and he chopped the oak tree down. And in its place, he planted a fir tree, pointing to the fact that it was evergreen, suggesting God's everlasting love, and the fact that it was triangular and pointing upwards, that it was pointing to heaven. From then on, it became increasingly popular in Germany, in particular, sort of in the time of the 6th century with Martin Luther's Protestants. But eventually, it did get to the UK, as I say, with Queen Charlotte. But I hinted that Prince Albert had played his part in popularizing it. And that was actually an article written in 1848 in the Illustrated London News entitled Christmas at Windsor. Now, up to this date, Christmas trees really weren't in many people's houses. They're just really in royal palaces. But this article appeared with showing Albert and Victoria with their children in front of a decorated Christmas tree. And after that, it became very popular amongst the aristocracy and also the wealthy middle class. Now, when I was a youngster, you'd go down to the greengrocer to buy your Christmas tree, and it would nearly always be a Norway spruce. But these days, if you go to the garden centre or wherever, there's a whole array of trees. In particular, there's often Nordman firs and Scots pines. And Jeremy has a starter for 10. What is the difference between these three types of tree? Pine, spruce, and fir. Well, first up, they are all conifers, and along with cycads and ginkgo, they form a group of plants called gymnosperms. They had their heyday in the Jurassic period, 200 to 145 million years ago. Since when, they've been in decline, and we just have about 1,000 species of gymnosperms now. That compares to almost 500,000 species of flowering plants. The word gymnosperm comes from gymnos, meaning naked, and sperma, meaning seed. And what it refers to is that the egg or the ova is not completely surrounded by tissue, as it is in the flowering plants. You might also be interested to know that gymnos, meaning naked, actually gives rise to our word gymnasium or gym, where ancient Greeks would actually exercise outside naked. Sorry, I digress. So it's back to the pine, the spruce, and the firs. And as you can see from the photographs on the right, they all look fairly similar. So the clue is to look at the needles. You've got to decide if they're single or in 2s, 3s, or 5s. And if they're single, how are they attached to the twig? Well, the pines are the easiest one because they're always in 2s, 3s, or 5s. And common pines in this country, the Scots pine, which is our native pine, and lodgepole pine, both are in 2s. And they're attached to the twig, as you can see here, in 2s, but with a sheath at its base. If it's a single needle, then it has to be either a spruce or fir. So with spruce, these are Norway spruce or Sitka spruce, you have the needles attached to the twig with a little peg. And when the needle falls off, if you look further down the twig, you can see that the pegs remain. It gives a sort of fairly rough, bumpy appearance. That's as opposed to fir trees, where the needles are attached with these sort of octopus or like suckers, or the old-fashioned kitchen plungers. And when they fall off, they leave, if you look further down the twig, a flat scar. Now, if the Norway spruce, the Christmas tree, has a lot of Christian tradition, the mistletoe has a lot of traditions wrapped up in sort of pagan celebrations. And it was well represented in Roman and Greek mythology, and in particular, Norse legends. The Druids also worshipped it, and also, particularly if the mistletoe was growing on oak. And, it's not surprising that the Romans, the Greeks, the Norse, the Druids actually thought this was a magical plant, because there it is, growing high up in the tree. When all the leaves are fallen from its host tree, it grows there without apparent root or without apparent source of food, forming a perfect green sphere. Now, if you haven't heard of the Norse legends, you probably have heard of the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe. And no one really knows where that comes from. It goes back centuries, but for a long time, mistletoe has been associated with fertility and also male virility. And that's probably something to do with its appearance. It's got those twinned leaves and also those sticky white berries. If you ask the general public about mistletoe, the one thing they're about to tell you, probably a biological fact, is that it's a parasite. But it's not a total parasite like dodder or the broom rakes. It's just a partial hemiparasite. And what that means is that it gets its water and nutrients from its host tree. But like any other green plant, it will photosynthesize and will produce its food by sunlight with CO2 and water. So what you have is a seed there germinating on a twig or branch. You can see it's sending in special house draw roots which penetrate the bark, and these then tap into the vessels which just lie just beneath the bark. And then, like any other green plant, it will send up a seedling, which will grow into that lovely green sphere we were talking about earlier. But the actual plants it will grow on, it's actually quite choosy. And the main plant it grows on in the UK is apple. And by apple, I mean the domestic apple. I don't mean the crab apple particularly. Also grows on a number of other trees, lime, hawthorn, and poplar. And if you actually have bought mistletoe from the garden centre, it's probably been growing on poplar, because most of the mistletoe comes from northern France, where it particularly grows on the poplar tree in particular. If mistletoe itself is quite choosy where it grows, then the birds that eat it are also quite choosy. Fieldfares and redwings quite commonly eat it, but the one that's particularly associated with mistletoe is the mistle thrush. And it's called that because it's the thrush that eats the mistle berries. It's quite a big bird. It swallows the berry whole. And because of the laxative effect, it ends up passing it out the other end about 30 minutes later. And as you can see on the right, it just hangs there. So quite a lot of the seeds that aren't in the right place to germinate. In recent decades, people have noticed that mistletoe seems to be moving east from its heartlands round at these sort of orchards of Herefordshire. And it's thought to be due to this little bird, the blackcap, who is increasingly overwintering in the UK. And it's a bit of a mistletoe specialist. It's a much smaller bird than the thrush. It doesn't swallow the berry whole. It will just swallow the pulp, and then it will wipe the seed with its beak either side of the twig. And as you can see on the right, the seeds are then perfectly placed to germinate. Now, mistletoe and the Norway spruce, the Christmas tree, have had centuries of traditions. But Amaryllis and poinsettia, as I said earlier, these are two newcomers to the Christmas scene. But that doesn't stop them having fascinating histories and also biology as well. And I've got a secret to tell you, but don't tell anybody else. Amaryllis makes the perfect emergency Christmas present. Just need to buy 1 or 2 bulbs, wrap them up, say Happy Christmas, in my case, Love Ian, but don't say who it's to. So when you get an unexpected caller with an unexpected gift, you don't need to panic or feel embarrassed because you've got your Amaryllis bulb already wrapped up there to give them a return Christmas present. And of course, if you don't have any unexpected friends calling around with gifts, you've got a bulb to plant, and gosh, doesn't it grow? Yeah, as you can see here, it's grown, what, 60 centimeters? It's already flowering just within 25 days. You can watch it flower, and obviously it will turn to fruit and then seed. And it's in its native South America that how it propagates itself. The bulbs you buy in the shop are propagated by a different way. And like our native bluebell, which also propagates itself by seed, from a seed to actually having a bulb large enough to flower, it takes 6 years. But the good news is, in both in bluebell's case and the Amaryllis case, that it's the bulbs will last them for 60 or more years in the right conditions. Now, Amaryllis, like 85% of our flowering plants, contains both male and female parts. Has the male stamens and it has the female style and stigma. The ovary is just out, is not seen in this photograph. And obviously, each plant has the option of either self-pollinating or cross-pollinating. Cross-pollination is much better because you get genetic mixing. Now, before I deal with what Amaryllis does to propagate, to make sure it cross-pollinates rather than self-pollinates, some of you might be thinking, well, what about the other 15% of plants? Well, these have separate male and female flowers, and we've actually had 2 examples of this already. One is mistletoe, and it is dioecious, and that in Latin means 2 houses. So it has male plants and female plants, which respectively have male flowers and female flowers. And it's obviously the female plant which will only give rise to the berries. Although if you've got a female plant, it won't necessarily produce berries. It needs a male plant nearby for it to be pollinated. The other one, which has separate male and female flowers, which we've mentioned already, is the Scots Pine. And so it has male cones. These are quite largest male cones, which are quite prominent in spring and early summer, which produces a lot of pollen, and also some way away, but on the same plant are the female cones, these small pink cones you can see there on the bottom left-hand corner. And when these get pollinated, these will eventually grow into the cones, which fall to the ground and are picked up by children. Now, back to the Amaryllis. And this has 2 tricks up its sleeve to enable it to cross-pollinate rather than self-pollinate. First one is very common for a lot of plants to do this, and the male anther actually sheds the pollen before the female stigma is receptive to the pollen. And some plants do it the other way around. The female stigma is receptive first. But the Amaryllis has something which is quite unusual, really, and it has 2 phases. It has an early male phase and a later female phase. And what that means, in the early male phase, you can see here the stigma is low, below the stamens and the anthers. So at the entrance of the flower, it's the anthers which are there rather than the stigma. But later on, you can see the stigmas come up, and that is more in the trajectory of any insect coming in. So look at it more closely. And the sort of insects which are going to be pollinating these plants in South America are carpenter bees. They're the sort of bees which make our bumblebee look quite small. So in the male phase, there's the anthers waiting to deposit the pollen. But in the female phase, there's the stigma, which is waiting to receive the pollen if the carpenter bee is actually covered in it. If all that sounds rather exotic in South America, there is a plant in the UK which does exactly the same, and that's the honeysuckle. And it has a phase in the first night and also a female phase in the second night. And it's often pollinated by moths, in particular the hawk moth. And as you can see, the first night the flower opens, the stigma is well out of the way of the flower entrance. But come the second night, it's in the female phase and the stigma's moved up to be at the flower entrance, and the stamens and the anthers are below. Now, I want to move from South America to North America, and in particular to Mexico, and also to the United States of America, and talk about poinsettias. As I said, they're a recent newcomer to the UK, and we now buy, I think, about 4 million plants each year, and that compares to about 8 million Christmas trees. But that's nothing compared to the United States, where there's 70 million or so plants bought for Christmas or Thanksgiving, which is the fourth Thursday of November. And we have this chap, Joe Robert Poinsett, who, I mean, he has been responsible for cultivation and also for its common name. And he was the first ambassador to Mexico in the early 1820s, when Mexico was first became a country. He wasn't just a diplomat, he was also a keen botanist and horticulturalist. So he sent seeds and plants back to his home in South Carolina. As you can see on the statue on the left-hand side, someone's very kindly put a poinsettia next to him. But that wasn't the plant that he sent back to South Carolina. What he sent back, or probably the saplings or the seeds of it, was a 4-meter tree. In every other respect, it probably was very similar to the plant we actually buy as a pot plant. It has these bright red colored bracts, which are acting a bit like petals to attract insects to these sort of small central flowers. Now, many of you probably already noticed that it's actually a euphorbia. So it's just like the euphorbias that you grow in your garden, or the spurges that which also euphorbias, which grow in our countryside, it has amazingly complex and interesting, and in my case, a beautiful flower. So when you're next passing a poinsettia in full flower, take a look. Now, I don't mean I look like that. I mean, get out the magnifying lens and take a really close look. And there really is quite amazing plants. They've got small male flowers and small female flowers. So it's monoecious, just like Scots Pine. And they also have these bizarre glandular structures as well. So how do we get from A to B, from the large 4-meter tree to the Christmas pot plant? Well, the answer is 150 years of plant breeding has brought the plant gradually smaller and smaller. And these days, a bacterial infection is introduced, Phytophthora, which will cause the plant to actually produce more flowering buds than leaf buds. So you then get a plethora of flowers. So we've got the perfect Christmas pot plant. But we obviously need to popularize it. And this came from this particular chap, Paul Eck, who inherited his parents' poinsettia nursery in the early 1960s. And he went about sending poinsettias to all the television companies around the United States. So poinsettias appeared on newscasters' desks and also in the studios of talk shows as well, thereby popularizing the plant. But obviously, we need to get the plant ready for Christmas or Thanksgiving. And how do we go about doing that? We need to get it to flower, because if it flowers, it will then produce those lovely deep red bracts, which is why we buy it. Well, for a long time, people thought that flowers, time of flowering depended upon the hours of daylight, because in some ways that sounds quite logical. But in fact, it's the opposite. It's the hours of darkness which are important when it comes to start initiating flowering. And poinsettias are what we would call short day plants. And that means they need 12 to 14 hours of darkness per night in October to late November to flower, and thereby produce bracts which are a dark red. So short day plants, or maybe they should be called long night plants, really. They have long hours of darkness, and that will produce flowering. And these plants tend to occur in flower rather in early spring or autumn. If you have short day plants, then you obviously have the opposite, long day plants, or maybe what we should be called short night plants. They have short hours of darkness, and that will initiate flowering, and they will tend to flower in the summer. Quick question is, how do you get those summer plants for Christmas, Valentine's Day, and Mothering Sunday? Well, obviously you could choose a day neutral plant, which doesn't really depend upon the hours of darkness, such as roses, which is probably why roses occur quite frequently in bouquets in the winter months. But commercial growers have learned a trick, and that is if you have a flash of light, particularly in the red spectrum, halfway through the long hours of darkness, it will cause a plant which normally flowers in the summer to actually flower in the winter. Now, you've probably bought your poinsettia and your Amaryllis in a supermarket. And before we leave the supermarket, I want to take you back to the fruit and veg section. And Jeremy has another question. What do these 6 vegetables have in common? Kale, cabbage, the Christmas plant we're talking about, Brussels sprouts, carobi, cauliflower, and broccoli. And the answer is, despite all looking so different, they are all cultivars of this particular plant, the wild cabbage. It grows in mainland Europe. It does grow in the UK, but tends to be sort of down towards the south. Now, it's not particularly a very competitive plant, but it does tolerate salt, and it does tolerate calcium. So it's often found growing close to the coast on limestone or chalk cliffs. And it's actually those 6 vegetables I talked about have actually evolved over thousands of years by selective plant breeding, where a particular part of the plant was chosen and then enhanced. And the first one which came into cultivation, and the Greeks and the Romans knew about it, was kale. And that was selected really to produce larger leaves. And it's the plant which looks most like its parent plant, the wild cabbage. Really, like a lot of the other brassicas, there are now a whole, there's many different varieties. That goes for the other brassicas as well. And new varieties are still appearing. The next one to be selectively bred was the cabbage, and it was in cultivation in the 12th century. And that's been bred from the growing tip or the terminal bud. So if you can imagine a terminal leaf bud or the growing tip increase in size hundreds of times, that's what a cabbage is. And you get a better impression of that if you actually cut the cabbage in half. Now, Brussels sprouts are really just baby cabbages. And again, if you cut the cabbage and the Brussels sprout in half, you can see they look really similar. And the Brussels sprout is only really a miniature version of the cabbage. And that gives us a clue about where they came from. because rather than coming from the growing tip or the apical bud, Brussels sprouts have evolved from the lateral or the axillary buds, just actually in the axil between the stem and the leaf stem. But like the cabbage, they've been increased in size many times. And you probably get better impression of that if, as seems to be more and more common, people buy Brussels sprouts actually on the stalk still. So if you actually look there, you've got the Brussels sprouts, which are the axillary sort of leaf buds, and beneath it are the scars from the leaf stalks. Carobi, that most strange of vegetables, that's actually been bred from the stem base, and you get an impression of that by all the leaves that have come off it. And some of the varieties have the taproot occurring partly above the ground, and that even again you get the impression of the fat stem base. Cauliflower, like the Brussels sprouts we've been talking about, and also broccoli, was in cultivation by about the 16th century. And the name cauliflower is actually quite well chosen because that is just what it is. It has been bred and cultivated from the inflorescence or the flower cluster. And a bit like the cabbage, if you actually cut it in half, you can actually get a better impression of it. And you can see those florets, which again, another good name for the actual cauliflower. Broccoli is very similar, but in broccoli's case, it's been selected not just for the inflorescence or the flower, but also for the stem as well. And if you needed proof that these plants have evolved from the wild cabbage, if you leave, say, broccoli in the ground for too long, it will come into flower. And also, if you leave it in the fridge for too long, sometimes you'll see it coming into flower, and it will have that typical cabbage flower for yellow petals. Now, if you're anything like me, I don't like shopping, so let's get back home and let's go out into the garden where we grow snowdrops and Christmas rose. We like to grow those two plants because they sort of start off the season, so to speak, and we like to have a number of plants which will be available for pollinators really from very early spring right through to late autumn. And with global warming, people often think if you go out walking at Christmas, you'll see more and more flowers, sometimes not the best specimens. And most people often think these are early spring flowers, and that's not the case. There's been a number of studies, including the plant hunt we did last Christmas ourselves with the Wharfedale Nats, and about half of them are autumn stragglers. These are plants which flower in late summer, and you often find a few hogweeds, yarrow, things like that growing in around Christmas time. About 25% of our plants, which are true winter flowering plants, like the ones we're talking about, also maybe perhaps including plants like gorse and groundsel, which flower throughout the whole year. And lastly, about a quarter are early spring flowering plants, such as lesser celandine or primrose, something like that. Now, I want to start talking about Helibore first of all, and I've also included winter aconite, because although Helibores can naturalize in the countryside, the winter aconite is much more likely to be naturalizing in our surrounding countryside. And coming back to my choir boy days, in some parts of the country, they're actually known as choir boys because of these three green bracts which subtend or just beneath the flower. It's like a choir boy's ruff. And when I mentioned this to a group of walking friends, one person said, well, actually, we used to call it Kermit flowers when I was young. And I really like the imagination of children. And that's obviously because of the ruff around Kermit's neck. Now, both the Helibore and also the winter aconite, they are both members of the buttercup family. And here we've got sort of typical creeping or meadow buttercup, and they have 5 petals and also 5 sepals. People often get a little bit confused about what sepals are, but they're really just small, often green like leaflets which cover the flower bud itself and protect it. And then as the flower opens, the sepals get pushed back and eventually lie sort of quite inconspicuously beneath the petals. Well, when it comes to the Helibore and the winter aconite, what most people think of petals are actually the sepals. In fact, some people call them Petaloid Sepals. So what's happened to the petals? Well, if you look closely, there's a ring of small vase-like structures just outside the stamens. And this is where the petals have actually changed into nectaries, which provide nectar to insects and increase the chance of the plants being pollinated. Now, as I said, both of them are winter flowering plants, or the Helibore and the winter aconite, and it's quite difficult to attract pollinators because there aren't that many around. And they try to attract pollinators by two ways. One is nectar is easily accessed by a wide variety of insects. So it's not like an orchid, which is you have this very specialized insect species for each plant. So many insects can easily access the nectar inside these nectaries. Also, there's natural yeast which ferment and they raise the temperature of the nectar and thereby again also increase the chance of being pollinated. Now, Snowdrop, our other winter flowering plant, does occasionally get pollinated by insects, but not that commonly. It tends to spread via by daughter bulbs forming, and that's why you often get these lovely sways of snowdrops. And looking at that photograph on the right, it's hard to imagine they're not a native plant, but they have been introduced a long time ago. No one's really quite sure how, though. People think either it's the church or it's the aristocracy. Now, it's certainly true to say that church has and abbeys and marshes have large amounts of snowdrops in their grounds. Also, lots of country estates also have large swathes of snowdrops as well. But my money is it being on the church, because Candlemas, which is on the 2nd of February, and that's the end of Christmas in the Orthodox churches, in Greek Orthodox churches and the Russian Orthodox churches. Also, it's the time when the candles get blessed for the coming year. And in the Catholic Church, they also celebrate the purification of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And so therefore, churches are going to want flowers to decorate the church, their building. And there aren't that many flowers around. And it's a time, beginning of February, when there will be snowdrops around. But for me, the thing about snowdrops, it's just a minor miracle that these really delicate flowers can flower in winter. And in France, they're known as Perce-Neige, which means snowpiercer. And how can they flower in the depths of winter? Well, they start preparing for it in the previous summer. And once the flowers die, the leaves will then send down food to be stored in the scale leaves on the outside. Now, I've included a onion bulb on the right-hand side so you can see things a little bit more clearly. Also, by the summer, they've actually already formed the flower bud and also the leaves in the very center. And as any gardener will know, if you've got pebbles and stones in the ground during the winter, the actual stones will rise to the surface as the ground gets frozen and then thaws, etc. So they have these contractile roots to keep the bulb down in the ground. Then, in the depths of winter, they start to grow, and they're obviously growing now. And if you go out into your garden or when you're out in the countryside, have a feel of the tips, and they are really hard. And that's because they've got to penetrate frozen ground. They also have a sheath around them to help protect them as well. And then when it comes to flowering, they have these spathes, which are acting a bit like sepals to protect the flower bud. And once the flower's opened, the spathe is there up above the flower. And you get a very similar appearance with daffodils as well. Now, for those two plants, which you might have been a bit surprised about, one was the blackthorn, which gives us sloes. And for me, I start to think about Christmas sort of early autumn time, believe it or not. That's because every year we make either damson gin or sloe gin. Damson gin is usually made in September, and the sloe gin usually towards the end of October. It's quite good if you can actually get the first frost on it because it decreases the tannins, but you've got to be quick because the birds will get the sloes otherwise. Blackthorn's a native plant, but damson comes from the Middle East, and it's called damson because it takes its name from the capital city of Syria, Damascus. Now, it's too late to make damson or sloe gin now, but I thought I'd tell you how I do it so you can do it next year. You just need 3 ingredients: sugar, gin, and sloes or damsons. What you need to do is you get your kiln jar or any other jar. I put the sugar in up to about 1/4 of the way up. Then I put the damsons or sloes in, which I pricked all over with a fork to about the 3/4 mark. And then I fill it up with gin, give it a good shake, put it in the cellar. Or you can put it under the sink, give it a shake from time to time. And then the week before Christmas, you can filter it and you have this wonderful liqueur, or perhaps just serve it a bit like port with cheese. Both the blackthorn and the damson are both members of the rose family, and they're both members of the Prunus genus, which is Latin for plum. And that particular genus gives us a whole array of different soft fruits: cherries, peaches, apricots, nectarines, and plums. And one of the things that is common to all of them is they all have the same sort of fruit, which is called a drupe. Here's a peach, and if you cut it in half, you have the skin, the flesh, and the stone in the middle, the exo, the meso, and the endocarp. And cut the stone in half, and you're left with what people often refer to as the kernel, and it's actually botanically a seed. Now, I'm going to be a bit sneaky and actually put in a 13th plant, and the clue is in this slide: Christmas cake, stollen, and Battenberg. And it's marzipan, which is almonds or ground almonds with sugar or, in the past, honey. And the observant of you will notice also that almonds are also part of the same genus, Prunus. And they look nothing like the plums, etc., until you start considering what they're like on the tree. They look like green, furry plums. The actual fruit itself opens up on the tree, and you can then see the skin and the flesh, which form what people often refer to as the hull. And in the center is the stone. Crack the stone open, and you get the seed, which people often refer to as a nut, but actually, botanically speaking, it's actually the seed. Now, almonds, a bit like damsons, come from the Middle East, in particular, Iran. And it's one of the foods which have been cultivated for centuries. And they actually found almonds in Tutankhamun's tomb. These days, though, it's actually California that produces most of the world's almonds. And I quite like almonds. I quite like marzipan on my Christmas cake as well. But I'm a bit concerned that it's actually not that greener food product, because in February, almost 1.5 million beehives are taken from around the United States and driven on a lorry to California to help pollinate the almond trees. They also require large amounts of water as well. Now, the other surprise entrant, so to speak, in the 12 plants of Christmas was the sweet chestnut. And we'll come on to why I put it in a moment. But it is one of my favorite trees. You've got those wonderful brown, shiny chestnuts in those prickly casing, the bark which spirals around the trunk, and those beautiful green leaves with the serrated edge. But the reason why I put it in is that when I was young, we used to live on the outskirts of London, And as a special treat, we would get taken up to London in December sometime to look at the lights along Oxford Street. At the end of the day, it cost nothing to window shop. Probably got taken to see the tree in Trafalgar Square and maybe even going to the cinema. But for me, the highlight was actually buying a bag of roasted chestnuts off these people, off the vendors who seem to be really on every street corner. And it's something I still do today. If I'm in a market or supermarket or greengrocer and I see chestnuts, I have to pick some up. And they're very easy to actually roast. Take a sharp knife and do a cross, as you can see there. Put them in a hot oven for up to 30 minutes. They tend to open up. Then serve them hot with salt. And while you're eating them, have a think about what you're actually eating. What you're actually eating are the seed leaves or the cotyledons, actually full of starch. Now, every plant has cotyledons in the seed, usually 2, sometimes 1, and they don't always appear above ground, but when they do, they look quite different to the more mature leaves, as you can see here. Obviously, sweet chestnuts are completely different from horse chestnuts, completely different family, although superficially the actual chestnuts look fairly similar. And of course, horse chestnut gets its name from the scars that the leaves leave. It looks like a horseshoe when the leaves are dropped in the autumn. Sweet chestnut comes from the beech family, and the beech and the oak are both native trees and get pollinated by wind, whereas the sweet chestnut is non-native, and it actually gets insect pollinated, and it has these amazing white catkins which look a bit like big pipe cleaners in July, and it's quite a pungent smell that arises from which attracts the insects. As I said, they're not native, and they actually come from the Mediterranean, and they were brought initially to the UK by the Romans to help feed their army. They also brought quite a few other plants as well to help feed the army: onions, leeks, modern day cereals, walnuts, and the curse of many a gardener, ground elder as well, which was used as a vegetable. Now I'm going to stay with food plants and talk about the cranberry. Most people probably think of cranberry, the general public that is sort of as a jar you buy from Ocean Spray in the local supermarket. But I'm going to let you into another secret. I can leave my house and within about 1/4 of a mile, I can find cranberry plants. I go up passing, as I climb the moor, passing bilberry, which is very closely related to the cranberry. In the winter, it will just be twigs, but in the spring, it produces fantastic lime green leaves. And then a few weeks later, these beautiful pink flowers. Then late summer, it will produce the bilberry itself. Not easy to see, but you know when they're ready to pick because the wood pigeon poo turns purple. And as I climb the moor, what I'm looking for cranberries is I'm looking for particularly damp areas where there's standing water and there's sphagnum moss and often insectivorous plants like the sundew on the right. And then it's a hands and knee job, or rather wet knees, because you've got to get down on the ground to have a close look because the plant is actually relatively small and looks very similar in some ways to the bilberry, but in miniature. It produces these lovely pink flowers, which come the end of summer, early autumn, will produce these sort of orangey red berries. Now, there's been a bit of an invasion in recent decades from the other side of the Atlantic, from America. And what I'm talking about is the bilberry seems to be surpassed by the blueberry now, and our native cranberry by the American cranberry. And I'm sort of reminded about the American GIs during the war. And it was said of the American GIs that they were overpaid, oversexed, and over here. And with the blueberry and the American cranberry, I would say they're overlarge, overrated, and over here. Now, as we've seen with poinsettias and almonds, Americans don't do things by half. So when they're cultivating cranberries, they have huge fields of them. The American cranberry, like our cranberry, likes wet conditions. So they're in irrigated fields. And when it comes for time to be harvested, they flood the field with water to about 30 centimeters. They send in the harvesters, which they don't actually pick up the cranberries, they let them float on top of the water. And then they are corralled together, and they come along, they suck them all out, and they get taken to the factory to be processed. Now, for my last two plants, I want to turn to native plants, the holly and the ivy. And they will be forever linked by the carol, the holly and the ivy. When they're both fully grown, of all trees that are in the wood, the holly bears the crown. And it's thought that the holly represents Jesus and the ivy represents Mary. Although some people have said it's actually the battle of the sexes. A bit like the 12 Days of Christmas, we'll never know because we've got no idea who wrote the original carol. People often hang a holly wreath on their doors. It's said that it represents the crown of thorns and the berries represent the blood of Christ. But really for centuries, people have been hanging holly on their doors to ward off witches and to make sure that evil spirits just don't settle on people's houses. And I'm just wondering whether or not the National Trust got that idea for putting holly on the seats around their houses so that people wouldn't sit down on their antique furniture. Now, maybe I'm a bit more of an ivy person than a holly person because ivy has a strong association with alcohol. And Bacchus, the god of intoxication, and Dionysus, the god of the grape harvest, both wore crowns which were partly made out of ivy. Ivy grows over lots of different plants, and it was thought that if you could have a goblet made out of ivy, it would somehow protect you from the intoxicating effects of the alcohol. It also grows over buildings, and English Heritage was a bit concerned about their buildings, and they asked Oxford University to take a look. It's good news. It makes the buildings 50% warmer in the winter and also cooler in the summer, and it protects it from frost, salt, and other pollutants. So as long as you keep it out of the gutters and the roof space, it's actually quite a good plant to have. Certainly a good place for small birds to nest and also insects as well. Now, the holly and the ivy, both are quite different sorts of plants and from completely different families, but they have quite a lot in common. They're both broadleaf and evergreen, which is quite unusual. They both have two different types of leaf. They're both good sources of nectar, and they also a good source of late winter berries for birds. And as I've already said, great nesting sites for birds, insects, and small mammals. Mammals in particular within the dry leaf litter in the beneath holly trees. As you can see here, both the ivy and holly are quite commonly growing in deciduous woodland, and therefore they don't really get a lot of light during the summer months. So by being evergreen, they will sort of make up for that in the spring and autumn when there isn't the tree canopy. Now, there are other things they do physiologically to increase their chance of photosynthesizing during the summer months, but that may be for another talk. What many of you will find quite interesting is that they both have two different types of leaf. Go past a holly tree and you'll find the lower branches have the typical holly leaf with the spines. But if you look up, you'll find there are leaves there without any spines at all. Now, the lower branches are, with the lower leaves are there, the spines are there to protect being eaten by herbivores. But when you don't need to be protected against grazing herbivores above 2 or 3 meters, then you lose the spines because it takes more energy to actually produce the spines. It's very similar. Also with ivy, you have two different types of leaf. We have the standard ivy leaf, which we all know about, but also if you look, there's also flowering stems, quite different. The juvenile leaves have the twigs they arise from actually will have the adventitious roots which stick it to surfaces of buildings and the trunks of trees. That's not the case in the flowering shoots, and you can see you've got completely different leaves that I've just mentioned. They're also good sources of nectar. Holly is dioecious, like mistletoe, and it produces these very small flowers, which often go unnoticed, and are a good source of nectar for a few weeks in May. But it's actually the ivy which is fantastic, and for in the autumn months, because it flowers in September through to November, it's a great chance for insects to fill up just before winter arrives. So hibernating queen wasps and queen bumblebees will want to be feeding on it. Also, honeybees as well will be storing up to feed the colony over the winter months. And a bit like really the nectar is in the Helibore and the winter aconite, they're fairly easily accessed by many different insects. So you have the anthers on the outside, the stigma in the center, and its nectar secreting disc. And if you are close to a wall covered in ivy in the autumn, and it's a sunny day, you can hear this buzz going on in the background. There's all sorts of insects have been invited to the banquet. As I said, also, it's great for winter berries for birds. And there's a holly tree which I go past on my running route. And around Christmas time, it's completely full of berries, as you can see there. But come March, they've disappeared. And the reason why they weren't not eaten earlier is that they actually are quite toxic. But the increasing amounts of cold weather that comes sort of around December and January time decreases toxicity, and then the birds are keen to eat them. With the case of the ivy, it just flowers so late, it just takes months for the actual fruit to mature. And you can see the anthers have been lost, or the stamens rather, but the stigma has remained. And it sort of reminds me of an old-fashioned childhood treat, the 99. So the ornithologists amongst you will probably realize that certain berries are available for the birds throughout the period from late summer to the late winter. So in late summer, you have the blackberries and bilberries. Then the autumn, you've got the rowan and the elderberries. Early winter, the sloes and the haws we've already spoken about. And then late winter, the ivy and the hollyberries. And I'm sure you can think of ones in between. So that is my 12 plants of Christmas. I hope you've enjoyed it. Hope you've enjoyed it. Maybe you may well have chosen different plants. And it really just leaves me to say thank you for listening. And I'd like to wish you all a very happy Christmas. Thank you. I can see if I can stop sharing.
Thank you, Ian. That's just an incredible range of disciplines. To say it was a talk about plants to include history, literature, religion, geography, as well as the science and more. I think when we can get back to pub quizzes, I'm in your team, please.
Oh, I don't know about that.
So we're a bit later than usual, but we've got time just for a couple of questions, I think. One or two, picking up on the piece about the spikiness of the holly leaves. Right. And it seems not always just to be the height of the leaves, but if you've got a tree that's grazed on one side and not the other, you often see that. So is it sort of prompted by the action of browsing to form spikes? I honestly don't know, to be honest with you. I did hear that on the radio a day or two ago. There was a paper that came out about that. I'm not personally actually been aware of that because but next time I'm out and there's a holly bush, I will actually have a closer look to see if it's actually that is true or not.
I mean, both the leaves which are higher up and the leaves which are lower down have the genes to make the spines. It's just that the plant switches it off. And it is always possible that it may somehow have sort of, I mean, plants are more intelligent than we probably think, really, and may well be sending auxins, plant hormones, to change the way that the leaves grow. And the answer is, to be honest with you, I'm not quite sure.
Okay, well, a more topical and perhaps easier one. The question's asked, what's the commonest type of Christmas tree in the UK? Going back to your pines, ferns, firs and spruces.
Well, I don't have the statistics, but looking around at local garden centres and Mortons and greengrocers, I think it's the Northern fir now. We've got a Northern fir downstairs, and that certainly seems much more popular than the Norway spruce was when I was a kid, really. You get the occasional Scots Pine on other species, but I think the Northern fir must be the commonest one by now.
I think it probably is, which is a shame, because we always try and find out a Norway spruce just for the scent. Look, time's getting on. Thanks ever so much, Ian. I'll pass you back to Helen to sum up.
Well, Ian, I mean, Jeff's already said what a fantastic talk that was, with a bit of absolutely everything, as you said yourself, history, geography, but also, you know, wonderful bits of personal history, also amazing facts, etymological facts, like the one about Damascus and damsons. Who knew? I mean, absolutely fantastic. And little bits of cultural knowledge peppering the way. I mean, the thing about Father Christmas's tunic being green, I'm just flabbergasted. I never knew, and it was Coke.
Yes.
Absolutely outrageous. Yeah.
Yeah, I agree.
But what a lot we have learned. A lot of wonderful botanical knowledge, evidently, on show as well. I loved particularly that whistle-stop tour through the brassicas. Each of which seems to have developed from a different part of the plant, in ways that you can really see when you kind of look closely at those different parts. So absolutely fantastic, Ian. I don't know how you've managed to put it together. Absolutely wonderful. How you, I guess it must be that you collect these facts and are able to sort of utilize them when the time's appropriate. And what a wonderful gift that is. So marvelous talk to round off what is the year for Wharfedale Naturalists. We will have, I think, another webinar on, I believe it's, let's see, it's the 4th of January. And yeah, there we go. Thank you, Jeff. So it's going to be Sarah Gibson talking about swifts and us, the life of the bird that sleeps in the sky. So do join us again at the start of 2022 to find out all about swifts. And thanks once again, Ian, for an absolutely marvellous talk. Have a lovely Christmas, everyone.
Yes, happy Christmas. Bye.
Bye-bye.